Lecture 13, Magnitogorsk. May 1931, a freight train shudders to a stop on the single rail spur that feeds Magnitogorsk, and the paperwork starts moving before anyone does. An OGPU escort drops to the ballast first, then the doors of a cattle wagon slide open onto the southern edge of the Urals, onto the treeless steppe, onto the Ural River, and onto Magnitogorsk Mountain, an iron deposit so magnetic it can make a compass needle misbehave. A magnetostroy clerk stands with a ledger and a stack of forms, turning families into line entries under the category Special Settlers. One of those names, preserved later in a local monograph compiled from regional archives, is Ibrahim Akhmetsionov, a Tatar peasant from Tatarstan delivered in 1931 with his family as part of the dekulakization deportations. The list does not need to describe the fence to have authority, the destination does that. Guarded barrack camps such as Centralny, wrapped in barbed wire, where movement is supervised and the first instruction is practical. Where to report for assignment, how to get a ration, which gate not to test. Work norms are not an inspiring abstraction in this setting, they are the condition attached to food, and the form that registers a man also makes him available for unskilled earthworks on a schedule the steppe did not approve. In that ledger, the city is already a population before it is a street. The clerk has separate bundles of papers, recruitment orders for Komsomol shock brigades, transfer directives for skilled blast furnace men brought from the Don base, guard manifests for prisoners shipped from camps such as Solovy, and passports and contracts for foreign specialists whose documents make them countable in a way the unfree labor is not. By mid-1930 the construction trust's workforce is already over 10,000, and by the first winter crisis of 1930-31 it is closer to 25,000, a headcount that matters because tents, mud huts, and barracks do not expand when the plan does. Within less than a decade the settlement will swell to over 200,000 residents, some estimates run as high as 250,000, by pulling in migrants, mobilized workers, prisoners, and deported peasants. A Komsomol badge can get a young volunteer into a brigade, an OGPU armband can keep him from getting back onto a train. In early 1931 internal passports turn movement into a privilege that has to be authorized, not assumed. Joseph Stalin does not need to set foot on this platform to be present. His portrait and his slogans hang on construction sites as a kind of membership card for everyone else. Sergei Ordzhonikidze, the heavy industry commissar, will be the man who can arrive later and scold managers about housing one day and demand speed the next, because his signature reaches into budgets and careers. The German modernist Ernst May is still associated with a rolled city plan drafted in 1930, full of zones and green belts, while John Scott will later describe the same place from inside a barrack stove's radius in a memoir published in 1942. Stephen Kotkin, reading archives decades later, will treat this as more than a factory project, because the community here is being assembled by decrees, contracts, and police rules, not by a meeting of neighbors. A few thousand kilometers west of that rail spur, the same project is packaged as an outing. In 1930-31, in Tourist, the state travel agency that manages foreigners, circulates a glossy print that reads like an invitation, see USSR Magnitogorsk steel mills. The image treats a blast furnace as something you might tour the way an older country tours a cathedral, except the souvenir is supposed to be faith in planned modernity. By January 1932, the photo magazine USSR in Construction can run an issue titled Magnitostroy, The Giant and the Builder, with constructivist photomontage and panoramic shots that make the site look as if it rose in clean geometric stages, and newsreels can cut the mud out of the frame the way a tailor cuts excess cloth. Those artifacts make a claim, a shining socialist city, a fortress of the future, a steel bulwark, guarding independence. On the platform at Magnitogorsk, the policy that makes the images possible is stamped onto travel orders, labor books, and guard manifests, and the difference between visitor and worker is not philosophical, it is which stamp lets you leave. Ibrahim Akhmetsionov's arrival in 1931 sits in the shadow of that travel poster like a bad edit. He comes in a cattle wagon under escort, not with an in-tourist guidebook. John Scott, writing later about the years 1932 to 1937, remembers winter mornings when a cart rolled past the barracks with a question that does not fit on a poster, any dead today? Because mortality is one of the few statistics the steppe and the schedule can agree on. When the same place can be marketed as sightseeing and managed as a controlled work site, belief stops being a private mood and starts looking like compliance with a form. Ernst May's drawing does not smell like coal, which is part of its charm. Drafted in 1930, the plan imagines a socialist settlement built with the same discipline as the plant, standardized housing blocks repeated like machine parts, green belts to buffer residences from industry, and zones that separate sleeping from smelting as if a line on paper could negotiate with soot. May is brought in as a foreign master planner, and by October 1930 he arrives to find that Magnitogorsk has already started without waiting for him. Local authorities under engineer P. Moscovoy have poured foundations and thrown up ad hoc wooden housing on the very ground May had earmarked for the new city, too close to the future furnaces, because the factory's timetable is the only one anyone gets fired for missing. Architecture histories preserve the moment as a collision. May unrolls the blueprint and realizes the built site refuses to match the planned one. On his paper, the map moves outward in a rational sequence: plant, then housing, then clubs and schools and parks, the whole package of modern urban life. And the policing apparatus is not drawn in bold but is implied by the fact that every planned city has an office where permits are issued and an administration that can enforce who belongs where. On the ground, the earliest settlements are makeshift barracks and dugouts, and by 1931 new arrivals like Ibrahim Akhmetsionov are being funneled into guarded camps such as Centralny, behind barbed wire, a spatial solution to a labor shortage that no green belt can hide. The same Ural River May wants to use as a clean dividing line between city and plant is also the water source that has to be pumped and dammed, and it will freeze, flood, and ignore the zoning map. The urgency that squeezes Magnitogorsk into a few frantic years is written first in tables, not in mud. In 1928 the Soviet leadership launches the first 5-year plan, and the targets read like a dare: nearly double coal output, triple pig iron, raise steel production by around 160%. Stalin has recently outmaneuvered rivals inside the party, Trotsky among them, and now the industrial program becomes a test of political control as much as economic capacity. Magnitogorsk is drafted as a showpiece inside that arithmetic, an entire metallurgical complex in the Urals meant to turn a largely agrarian country into a producer of rails, tractors, and tanks. The macro mood is equal parts crusade and siege. Moscow talks about capitalist encirclement by enemies such as Poland and Japan. Newspapers frame construction sites as battlegrounds where socialism fights backwardness, illiteracy, and the legacy of the Tsars. In 1929, as the Great Depression begins ripping through Western economies, Soviet propaganda can point at foreign unemployment lines and claim history is switching sides, even as Soviet procurement agents quietly shop for foreign machinery and expertise. Stalin's own public language turns time into a weapon. In 1931 he warns that the USSR is 50 to 100 years behind the advanced countries and must make up the distance in 10 years or be crushed. A sentence like that does not stay in a speech, it migrates into every construction order, every deadline, and every accusation of sabotage when a foundation is poured in the wrong place. For a peasant family like Ibrahim Akhmetsionov's, uprooted in the Great Break of collectivization and dekulakization, the plan is not something you debate. It is the reason a cattle wagon becomes a means of industrial policy. In Scott's barracks scenes from the early 1930s, propaganda is not a poster across town, it is something you handle with cold fingers. Young men from across the USSR crowd close to a makeshift stove because it is the only reliable heat system, and a Tatar worker named Shaimat reads Pravda aloud slowly, sounding out Russian syllables as much for literacy as for ideology. The paper carries the same language Moscow uses: shock work, records, the conquest of nature. And it sits beside the unromantic logistics of the place, a labor book, a ration line, a foreman's shouted order. Scott gives Ivan, a hard foreman transferred from the Donbass mines, the kind of contempt that comes from experience. New engineers trained in crash courses become 90-day wonders, because a blast furnace does not care how sincere you are. Somewhere outside that stove circle, the cultural version of the same story is being written in a different register. Valentin Kativ publishes Time, Forward. In 1932, a novel built around concrete pouring records and the refrain, "Never again shall we be Asia." Never, and Song of Magnitka and state newsreels insist the steppe is being turned into modernity by willpower. None of that cancels the fact that in early 1931 internal passports restrict travel and make leaving the site a question of permission, or that in May 1931 the OGPU is still escorting trainloads of dispossessed peasants into camps. When a utopian project is backed by fences, escorts, and documents, belief is no longer the fuel, it is the decoration on the machinery. The paper trail that delivers people in 1931 begins with a different sort of document in 1929, a Sovnarkom decree authorizing a giant metallurgical works in the Urals. It is one thing to talk about catching up and overtaking the West, it is another to assign a construction trust, a budget, and an output quota to a specific bend in a river. The choice of place is brutally material. Magnitogorsk mountain is not a metaphor, it is ore. Geologists treat it as a reserve of roughly 500 million tons of high-grade iron, some deposits running 60 to 70% iron, and the deposit's magnetic behavior becomes part of local law as soon as surveyors start laying out lines. The site is remote, but it is not blank. A Cossack outpost, Magnitogorsk, had been founded here in 1743 to guard the frontier and the mountains, or had been known since the 18th century. The new decree overlays this older geography with a planned sequence. On maps drawn for the project, the plant sits first, tight to the ore side, because the blast furnaces and open hearth shops need a short haul from mine to stack. Housing is sketched next, because a workforce has to sleep somewhere close enough to get to a shift without losing hours to travel. Cultural institutions appear as boxes, clubs, schools, a stadium, the badges of a modern city, and the administrative layer is embedded in the same grid, offices that issue permits, keep accounts, and file reports, the quiet infrastructure of surveillance that any state project assumes. Before there is a street to walk, there is already a layout deciding where bodies will cluster and where authority will sit. On June 30, 1929, the first construction train reaches the site on a spur line built fast enough to qualify as optimism. The moment is later celebrated as a founding day because it has all the pieces of a state origin story, a locomotive entering what contemporaries describe as empty step, surveyors and railway crews stepping down with tools, and security arriving as part of the shipment. Only a few hundred people are on the ground at first, engineers, geologists, OGPU guards, yet the administrative noun is already in use. A station sign reading Magnitogorsk can be erected before there are streets, shops, or even walls to justify the name, and the sign does what the decree did in Moscow. It declares that a place exists now because rail and authority agree to call it one. Pegs go into the soil, tents go up near the future blast furnace site, a canvas headquarters starts issuing orders under the banner of Magnitostroy. The Directorate Engineer Arkhipov has been put in charge of. Surveying itself supplies a first, involuntary lesson in local conditions. The iron mountain that makes the plant possible also interferes with the instruments meant to fix the future into coordinates, so the act of mapping can begin with a needle refusing to be steady. A voluntary commune might begin with a manifesto. This one begins with a timetable, a cargo manifest, and guards who ensure the timetable is not treated as a suggestion. The decree is followed by commitments large enough to trap its authors. Reports describe about 200 million rubles being poured into the project, and procurement orders pull trainload after trainload of timber, rails, and machinery toward a place that still has no roads. Administrative organs multiply around the site, trusts, committees, building sections, because a plant this size is also a paperwork factory, and by late 1929 the amount pledged makes backing out politically unthinkable. The state's solution to speed is not to slow down, it is to add bodies. Late in 1929, thousands of prisoners begin arriving under guard as groundwork accelerates, and by the end of that year Stalin has already ordered the deportation of socially harmful elements to remote sites, expanding the categories that can be assigned to a project. Loudspeakers carry the tone of Moscow onto the steppe. Accounts describe workers hearing Stalin's November 1929, year of the Great Break, speech broadcast at Magnitostroy to stiffen resolve, as if the cold could be argued with. Winter arrives anyway. The first 1929-30 season is spent in tents and dugouts. Letters and memoir fragments describe sub-zero nights with men burning rail ties for warmth, and one memo claims a dozen surveyors die from exposure before the city has a single permanent building. This is how the founding moment becomes more than a signature. The plan begins collecting its first payments immediately, in timber, in rail schedules, and in human bodies that can no longer pretend the project is optional. By March 1930, the drive for speed reaches across borders, into files written in English and signed in ink that will not freeze. On March 14, 1930 the Soviet state signs a major contract with Arthemke and Company, a Cleveland firm, to design the blast furnaces, coke ovens, and overall layout of the Magnitogorsk metallurgical combinat. The templates are not ideological, they are practical, and Key's engineers lean heavily on the model of U.S. Steel's Gary Works in Indiana because Gary is what a giant steel plant looks like when it actually functions. German firms are contracted for rolling mills, and the modernist May and his team are invited to plan the city, with their agreement negotiated that summer before May's October arrival. Ralph W. Stuck, Key's lead designer, is in Magnitogorsk by May 1930, supervising American engineering on a site that Soviet propaganda frames as proof socialism can surpass capitalism. Key's people are blunt about time. They point out it took 12.5 years to build Gary and ask how anyone expects to do this one in 3. Shipping lists and procurement records make the paradox tactile, all crushers from trailer, all engines from Cooper Bessemer, boilers, shovels, and specialized equipment arriving from abroad, while local Ural mines in 1929 still operate with a tiny fleet, only 17 small power shovels, each under 1 cubic meter, in a region where American mines use 3 cubic meter machines as a baseline. A socialist city of steel is being assembled with capitalist hardware and foreign blueprints, and the contradiction is not hidden, it is stapled into the project as a contract, a delivery schedule, and a training problem that will land, later, on the shoulders of foremen like Ivan and on laborers like Ibrahim Akhmetsionov, who arrive without contracts at all. The site responds to all this imported certainty with weather. Magnitogorsk sits on the border of Europe and Asia at the southern edge of the Ural Mountains, an open steppe described by contemporaries as tawny and featureless until you reach the black bulk of ore. Summers can be dry enough for dust storms, hot enough to make scaffolding untouchable, and thick with biting insects. Then winters arrive with blizzards and temperatures around -40°C that freeze pipes, fuel, and exposed skin with the same indifference. The shallow Ural River that makes the settlement possible as a water source is also prone to freezing and flooding, which means a line on a plan has to compete with ice and spring melt. In 1930, a rushed attempt to dam and control the river washes out and undoes days of labor overnight, a reminder that the water has not signed any construction schedule. Scott's details are procedural, not poetic. Welders stop every few minutes to warm their hands because metal tools become traps, and ink freezes while someone tries to write pay lists, as if the accounting system needs a blanket. Concrete does not set properly in deep cold, machinery seizes, deadlines continue to exist anyway because they exist in Moscow. Remoteness multiplies every problem. The nearest town of any size is about 200 kilometers away, there are no paved roads at the start, and every nail and loaf of bread depends on that single rail line. Early arrivals write that they feel as if they are living on Mars or at the end of the Earth, and the comparison is not a metaphor so much as a shipping receipt. Everything you need to survive has to be delivered from another planet. Speed creates its own landscape. By 1930, thousands of recruits are pouring in faster than the settlement can build walls, and the first neighborhoods are not neighborhoods so much as survival improvisations, tents, dugouts, mud huts, and long wooden barracks thrown up close to the plant site because walking distance beats urban theory. Accounts describe a sprawling shantytown nicknamed Shanghai, a place of self-built structures that spreads because it is the only housing that can be built at the pace people are arriving. Overcrowding and poor sanitation invite lice and outbreaks of typhus during the early 1930-31 crisis, and the clash between the planned city and the lived one becomes measurable in bodies and bed space. For the special settlers arriving under escort in 1931, the housing problem has an administrative solution. They are routed into guarded barrack camps such as Centralny, behind barbed wire, where the fence substitutes for a municipal boundary. Ibrahim Akhmetsionov is recorded in family memory as coming with 8 children. The first winter in the camp kills one of them, a fact that does not require interpretation to be brutal. Rations are distributed by category, and the categories have politics built into them. Skilled workers and priority specialists eat better than unskilled laborers, and those labeled spec-posulancy sit near the bottom. Work norms decide who is credited with a full ration. Failure is recorded as a shortfall, not as hunger. When desertion rises, when people try to slip onto freight trains to the west, internal passport controls tighten and movement is policed as labor discipline, because the city has arrived in the form of workforce statistics long before it arrives as plumbing. The daily schedule is calibrated to a project that assumes supplies will arrive on time, and then it runs into a world where a single broken rail can stall a city. Everything important comes by train, food shipments, spare parts, timber for barracks, the imported equipment McKee's plans require. When the rail line jams, shortages are not a rumor, they are visible as idle cranes, empty bread counters, and men assigned to manual loading, because machinery has not arrived or cannot operate in the cold. Managers prioritize what the plant needs first, coke batteries, furnace foundations, or handling, so civic basics become afterthoughts that never stop being urgent. May's 1930 plan can place parks, schools, and clubs in neat relation to housing blocks, but the lived city still depends on makeshift stoves, latrines, and water hauled from the Ural River or pumped through systems that freeze. In this environment, hierarchy becomes physical. Foreign specialists with contracts and passports are housed separately, in enclaves such as American Town, where Scott notes there is electricity, better food, and a sense of insulation from the worst shortages. Their presence is both essential and politically awkward, so it is managed with rules and distance. The special settlers, in Centralny, people like Ibrahim Akhmetsionov, are managed with fences, guard routines, and ration scales that require no awkward explanation. Everyone meets the same mud, but not everyone meets it from the same doorway. A travel poster can invite foreigners to admire steel mills, and the same project can still need a separate gate for those who arrived by cattle wagon. By mid-1930, the headcount has outgrown the camp's ability to pretend it is temporary. Magnitogorsk records show the workforce pushing past 10,000, swelled by Stalin's 25,000 and Komsomol volunteers recruited to build what propaganda calls the giant of socialism. Their arrival has a bureaucratic rhythm, travel orders, brigade rosters, allocation sheets for barrack space that does not exist yet. Work begins on a rail bridge over the Ural River to connect the Or side on the east bank with the proposed city side on the west, because the map's two halves have to be stitched together by more than rhetoric. Temporary Zemlyanki barracks are dug into the earth, and a field hospital is assembled early, a quiet admission that injury and disease are being scheduled alongside concrete pours. Supply breakdowns show up in the simplest inventory counts: not enough trucks, not enough cranes, not enough spare parts, which means that in 1930 a project designed with American-scale machinery in mind often reverts to hand labor, gangs with shovels and wheelbarrows moving earth the way peasants have always moved it. Engineers develop their own unofficial slogan: quickly, efficiently, cheaply, choose any two, and it circulates darkly through the site as a piece of folk wisdom that fits on the back of a requisition form. July 1, 1930 becomes a date that shows up in reports because it marks the moment belief hardens into a foundation. Groundwork begins for blast furnace number 1. The schedule attached to that foundation is the sort of thing planners can write only when they have not yet watched concrete freeze, roughly 18 months from finalized design to first iron. By the fall of 1930, concrete bases are in place not just for the blast furnace but for coke batteries and other plant structures, and the site looks, from certain angles, like a city of rebar and scaffolding waiting for walls. It is at this point that May arrives, unrolls his 1930 city plan, and finds the first housing already squatting where his streets are supposed to go, a clash between plant-first urgency and city-first hygiene. The winter that follows does not pause for that argument. The labor force surges toward 25,000, yet housing is still tents, dugouts, and barracks. Cold turns the ground and the people into brittle materials, lice thrive in overcrowded bunks, typhus spreads through the makeshift settlement. Desertion spikes. Thousands try to leave by hopping freight trains, and the state answers with document control, internal passports and tighter labor discipline rules that turn departure into an infraction. On paper, the project is a triumphant chart. In practice, it is a winter in which the city's most reliable public service is the whistle that starts a shift at 7 in the morning. Spring 1931 does not soften the project, it liquefies it. The thaw turns streets into mud fields, stalls trucks, and makes every delivery heavier, and it arrives at the same moment the labor shortage becomes undeniable on managers' charts. The state's answer is not to lower targets or slow pause, it is to change the composition of the workforce. In May 1931, the first trainloads of special settlers reach Magnitogorsk under OGPU escort, part of a larger relocation that will dump roughly 40,000 peasant families at the site over the year. These are people expelled from villages during collectivization and dekulakization, shipped east to solve a construction problem that looks, on paper, like turnover. They are placed in guarded barrack camps. Centralny is a name that appears in accounts, surrounded by barbed wire, with movement and labor treated as administrative facts. Ibrahim Akhmetzianov arrives in this wave from Tatarstan with his family. Later reconstructions remember 8 children and the death of 1 in that first winter, the kind of data that sits outside the 5-year plan tables but inside the project's real balance sheet. Food is tied to norms, and norms are supervised. At the same time, Gulag prisoners are shipped from established camps to do some of the hardest work, creating a parallel population whose presence is acknowledged in guard routines and ration calculations more than in posters. A city that cannot keep its volunteers can still keep its deportees, and the difference is written in who has to show a pass to step past a gate. If you want to see the system without reading a theory book, you can stand in front of the wrong wall. In offices and club rooms around Magnitogorsk in the early 1930s, posters, plans, and notices share space because there is nowhere else to put them. A travel print from Intourist sells the steel mills as a destination. A set of Ernst May's 1930 drawings lays out green buffers and standardized blocks. A typed announcement about labor discipline explains which documents are required to travel and which absences will be treated as violations. The claim, the design, and the enforcement language can coexist on the same plaster because the city itself is still being poured, and paper is the only finished surface. Outside, the plant structures rise first: furnace foundations, coke batteries, or handling systems, while housing and services lag behind the headcount, and the result is a settlement where districts can mean a fenced barracks camp, a cluster of tents, or a self-built lane in Shanghai. Scott's memoir keeps returning to small bureaucratic actions: a ration handed over a counter, a labor book checked, a cart that collects deaths like a clerk collects totals. In Centralny, Ibrahim Akhmetsionov's status as a special settler is not a personality trait, it is a rule set: where he sleeps, whether he can cross a gate, what food category his family falls into, how a work norm can be converted into bread. For the foreign specialist in American town, the contract and passport turn scarcity into inconvenience rather than crisis, and the separation is physical enough to measure by how far you have to walk to find electricity. In the archives, Kotkin later reads, these separations show up as categories and quotas, and the temptation is to treat them as abstractions. On the ground, they are navigational facts. The Ural River still freezes, the wind still drives smoke and dust toward whatever housing exists, and another train still has to be unloaded before the next set of forms can be filed. The first thing that holds its shape in the wind is the paper. In the barracks where Shaimet Kybulin still moves his lips over printed Russian, a newspaper is passed hand to hand like a tool, Pravda when it arrives, Magnitogorskaya Rabachia when it doesn't, and in either case the same arithmetic shows up. The first 5-year plan, written in Moscow as columns of pig iron and steel, reaches Magnitostroy not as an idea but as a daily schedule and a roster nailed to a wall. A shift whistle cuts across the Ural River, a brigade leader reads names, a clerk has a stamp, and the distance between backward and modern is reduced to whether today's line says 92% or 103%. Stalin's famous insistence that the country must make up 50 to 100 years in about 10 doesn't need to be heard in the Kremlin to become local weather. It arrives as a deadline attached to a blast furnace foundation poured on July 1, 1930, and it stays attached through the months when the steppe refuses to notice the deadline. In the official story, Magnitogorsk is a cure. In the pay office, it becomes a number you can be late for. There's a particular kind of authority that belongs to a chalkboard because chalk can be corrected faster than concrete. In Magnitogorsk, socialist competition takes the form of public tallies, brigades ranked, output posted, laggards named, and those postings make the claim physical. The work is not merely labor, it's proof. If a trench is dug, it is recorded. If a record is set, it is photographed. If the photograph travels, the record becomes true in more places than the trench ever will. Valentin Katiev's 1932 Time, Forward, turns a single day of concrete pouring into an epic of men racing time, and the novel's speed becomes a template for how people are expected to speak about their own exhaustion. A line about 5-year plan in 4 can hang from a half-built frame and function as a moral instruction without needing to explain metallurgy. In policy, the competition is supposed to motivate. In practice, it makes output legible to party oversight and turns every task into a vote you cast with your hands. The reward isn't only a bonus, it's being seen, and being seen is a kind of ration all by itself. Stephen Kotkin, writing decades later in Magnetic Mountain, reaches for a metaphor that is almost too neat: the city as an engineered organism, politics and culture and housing and labor fused into one designed system. The claim underneath Magnitogorsk wants that neatness. It starts from a diagnosis: old Russia as ignorance, class exploitation, peasant backwardness, and it proposes an alchemy: run people through industrial discipline and collective living and they come out purified, like or turn to pig iron. Production becomes a moral category because it's treated as the base on which everything else rests. A worker who overfulfills a norm is described as a hero of socialist labor. A worker who can't is described, increasingly, as more than tired. Shaimat's slow reading is already being recruited into that story. He is not only learning letters, he is being instructed that the letters point toward an obligation, and that the obligation has a measurable outcome. The seduction here is clarity: build steel and you build justice, build steel and you build a new person, build steel and you build the future on schedule. The missing piece is what you do when the schedule refuses you, and a whole architecture of compulsion is waiting in the margins to fill that gap. In the early 1930s, progress at Magnitostroy is constantly translated into documents that can travel without mud on their boots. Reports move upward to commissariats in Moscow with headings like plan fulfillment, with monthly figures that can be expressed as percentages of targets rather than descriptions of frozen machinery. The reports don't deny the cold, they reframe it as an obstacle being overcome, which is a subtler form of denial because it implies overcoming is a matter of will. If a foreman announces 98% in a morning assembly, the number functions like a verdict in public, and the assembly functions like a courtroom without a judge's rope. If it's 103%, the city has succeeded on paper even if the bridge still lacks a railing. When Sergei Ordzhonikidze comes through as People's Commissar for Heavy Industry and scolds what he sees, his scolding is powerful precisely because it can be translated back into new orders and new quotas. The plan can absorb critique as long as critique becomes another construction task, another line item, another proof that the engine is still running. The clearest handshake between ideology and procurement is dated, signed, and filed. On March 14, 1930, the Soviet state contracts Arthur G. Key and Company of Cleveland to design major parts of the Magnitogorsk iron and steel works, blast furnaces, coke ovens, the layout of an integrated plant that Soviet planners want to resemble U.S. Steel's Gary, Indiana, because modernity has a blueprint and the blueprint already exists. Crates of imported equipment and drawings in American industrial language arrive in the Urals as if the future could be shipped in sections. German firms are brought in for rolling mills, foreign specialists are placed on payroll, a few hundred outsiders become, briefly, a critical component of a project whose public voice insists it needs no help from the capitalist world. What the contract produces on the ground is not only a furnace design but a training problem. Men who have never seen a Bay City power shovel or a trailer crusher are expected to keep one alive through -30°C nights, and when a machine breaks, it is not merely downtime. It is a direct threat to the narrative that the plan is sovereign over matter. Ernst May's arrival in October 1930 adds another layer of paper, another kind of authority that exists most cleanly in drawings. May comes with a modernist conviction that a rational layout produces rational citizens, and with a brief to create a Sotsgorod, a socialist city form that would embody equality in its geometry. His initial, linear city, concept, separating residential areas from industry and imagining green belts as buffers, treats urban form as public health, and public health as moral hygiene. It is also, very specifically, a promise object, a picture you can point to while asking people to endure the present. On site, May discovers that construction has already begun chaotically on an unsuitable location, that the east bank and west bank of the Ural River have different constraints, and that the plan's clean separation is being violated by the need to put any roof over any head. He manages to build a nucleus of the planned city anyway, quarter number 1 on Pionerskaya Street, more than 30 standardized 4-story blocks that are supposed to be the seed of a new way of life. When Scheimer walks past the first completed facades, the claim is visible in brick, uniformity as equality, minimal ornament as a break with the past, modernity as a moral stance you can live inside. The solution, as the state understands it, is not simply to build an industrial plant and hope culture follows. It is to plan everything the way you plan a furnace, inputs, outputs, timing, discipline. Schedules and norms turn into a kind of constitution because they are the rules people actually touch. A brigade roster tells you where to stand, a shift schedule tells you when to sleep, a posted norm tells you what counts as enough, and enough is not only a wage question. It becomes a food question. Udarniki, shock workers, selected crews meant to model the tempo and the attitude the plan requires, and their status is public. Their names circulate in local papers, their output is posted, their rewards are structured not as indulgence but as evidence that virtue has a material form. When foremen conduct morning assemblies that include both output results and denunciations of slackers, the speech is simultaneously management, morality, and warning. Scheimer's presence in that crowd is part of the intended chemistry, a former header becoming an industrial worker by being forced to measure his day the way the plant measures its heat. Planned culture is built as quickly as possible because culture is treated as infrastructure. Clubs appear alongside barracks, not because leisure is a luxury but because ideology needs a room with a roof. Culture brigades and political instructors roam the site, Komsomol organizes schedule meetings that follow shifts. Technical training is paired with indoctrination because the state wants workers who can run dangerous machinery and repeat correct explanations for why they are doing it. Film screenings in a club can be both rest and rehearsal. Workers watch staged depictions of themselves building, and the loop tightens. By 1933, a structure like the Palace of Metallurgists exists as a formal address for culture, an imposing building that can host lectures, concerts, and rallies. A palace in a city where open sores still run through mud is not a punchline, it's a logistics choice. A palace is easier to photograph than a functioning water system, and photographs are one of the materials this project is made from. The more intimate parts of life are pulled into the plan using the same blunt tools. Communal kitchens and public canteens are not just a method for feeding thousands, they are a strategy for collectivizing domestic labor and making the population legible. Housing designs that omit private kitchens are ideological architecture. If you cannot cook privately, you must eat together, and if you eat together, you can be addressed together, counted together, and disciplined together. Childcare is envisioned as public infrastructure, crutches to free women for paid labor and to raise children as communists, while standardized clothing and coveralls are imagined as another kind of equality, bodies made interchangeable at the level of appearance. Planners like Strumeling could describe this as planning, the living of the masses, the way production is planned, and the phrase reads like a managerial slogan until you watch it land at a canteen counter where ration categories determine portions. When people improvise illegal stoves in corners, or partition space with sheets to create privacy, the improvisation is not rebellion in the romantic sense. It's the gap between a blueprint and a winter that does not recognize theory. Coercion is not a patch applied when the solution fails, it is built into the solution as a stabilizer. The reason is simple enough to be admitted in practice even when it is denied in slogans. Turnover threatens plan fulfillment, and plan fulfillment is treated as the city's moral purpose. Tens of thousands flee the site in the early years, the state responds by tightening the perimeter. An internal passport system and travel restrictions, implemented as early as 1931 in this environment of forced mobilization, turn paper into a gate at the station. Laws that punish quitting and absenteeism begin to appear across the USSR by 1932, and in Magnitogorsk they function as local climate. A worker who tries to leave is no longer simply a person changing jobs, he is labeled a deserter from labor, a category that makes departure sound like betrayal. The NKVD's presence, already embedded in the project through prisoner labor and surveillance, gains a second role, not only guarding camps but policing the city's unofficial economy and its human leakage. When raids for deserters and black marketeers sweep through the shantytown in 1932-33, the paperwork calls it administration. The streets call it a knock you don't ignore. Quarter number 1, the flagship of May's Sotsgorod, is where the promise becomes most literal and most embarrassing at the same time. The standardized 4-story blocks on Pionerskaya Street are meant to embody egalitarian modernity, and they do embody something: identical rooms, plain facades, a refusal of ornament that signals an ideological break with the past. They also embody the plan's assumptions about domesticity. Units are built without kitchens and, in early form, often without plumbing, because communal living is not a side note, it is the point. The absence is not an oversight. It is a design choice that presumes communal dining halls and bathhouses will exist on time and at scale. When utilities lag, when water is scarce, when communal facilities are unfinished, the design choice becomes a daily constraint that residents solve with contraband burners and buckets. The modernist courtyard that is supposed to provide light can become, in the steppe wind, an engineered tunnel of cold. May writes reports, Soviet architects criticize the plainness. May leaves the USSR in 1933 disillusioned, and the style begins to shift. The buildings remain, and the people inside them live with the consequences of a theory that was confident enough to remove kitchens before it had proved it could provide dinners. Outside the planned blocks, the city invents its own architecture under pressure. Shanghai, the shantytown of mud huts and makeshift shelters, grows because bodies arrive faster than brick. Earth dugouts and tents become semi-permanent, barbed wire zones house special settlers and convicts, temporary barracks become neighborhoods. The planned green belt buffer that is supposed to separate smoke from lungs is violated by necessity. This is not a simple story of failure, it is a story of competing builds. The state builds a showcase nucleus and calls it the city, thousands build their own shelter and call it survival. Ordzhonikidze can mock the situation during a visit and order housing to be moved across the river to the West Bank, treating geography itself as a variable that can be corrected by decree. The correction does not erase the lived fact that the planned city and the improvised city coexist, and that one of them is more likely to appear in official photographs. Those photographs are not decoration. In January 1932, USSR in Construction devotes an issue to Magnitogorsk, Magnitostroy, the giant and the builder, and the magazine's constructivist photomontage turns scaffolding into myth. Giant angles, heroic silhouettes, smokestacks framed like monuments, the visual language insists the city is already what it is becoming. A celebrated young shock worker in the issue can be named, posed, and used as a human proof of scale, the builder, standing in for tens of thousands whose names never make the page. The same period produces in tourist posters inviting foreigners to see the steel mills, an invitation that assumes visitors will treat half-built frames as already real industry because the paper says so. Art becomes a delivery system for the claim: if the image is persuasive, the project is persuasive. If the project is persuasive, the suffering can be interpreted as meaningful. Workers can watch propagandistic films of themselves in local clubs and participate in a loop where representation becomes a kind of ration, proof that someone, somewhere, is acknowledging what you are doing. Ritual fills the gaps that infrastructure can't. May Day and November 7th bring parades where workers march with banners praising Stalin and Magnitka, turning the steel plant into a civic deity with a nickname. The steelworks itself provides daily ceremonies, factory whistles that mark shift changes, sirens that replace church bells, the sound of the new order audible enough to set sleep patterns. On January 31, 1932, blast furnace number 1, Komsomolka, is lit in brutal cold. By February 1 it produces its first pig iron, A milestone announced in national press as if the metal were a political argument made visible. A rally around the first pour is not only jubilation, it is the required confirmation that production is not merely happening but is being received as salvation. In 1931, when honors like the Order of Lenin are awarded to the steel plant, the award ceremony functions as an economic signal as well as a moral one. The plant is sacred to the plan. Therefore the city around it must be sustained, therefore the people who sustain it can be sorted into categories that decide who eats first. The state's invented calendar includes a Sunday that is both leisure and a test. Communist Sundays, and subbotnik Labor Days, framed as voluntary demonstrations of selfless commitment, operate as social engineering by timetable. Show up to work unpaid and you have proved you understand what kind of person the future requires. On paper, it reads like moral education. On the ground, it looks like a work regime attached to a concept of virtue that can be audited. Participation can be turned into a list, the list can be turned into reputational value can be converted into better assignments and better access. The ritual does not eliminate the old calendar's fatigue, it repackages fatigue as evidence that you are participating in history. When a tired worker slips away from a mass event, that slip is not merely personal. It is a crack in the system's method for producing visible belief. The built environment is also an instrument for concentrating people where they can be watched and addressed. Canteens centralize food distribution, clubs centralize speech, announcement boards centralize reputation. Even when the architecture is meant to foster egalitarian interaction, it tends to produce visibility, and visibility is a form of control. Barbed wire around special settler barracks is a crude version of the same logic. The population is to be kept in place so the plan can count on it. John Scott's memoir, written later and published in 1942, remembers NKVD informers as part of the atmosphere, a reminder that the plan does not rely only on persuasion. It also relies on making the costs of non-compliance concrete. In this city, a building is never only a building, it is a policy you can walk into, and sometimes it is an enforcement perimeter with a roof. Once the claim, the solution, and the ritual are in place, the economy reads like a single sentence: everything serves the production quota. Magnitogorsk's managers report upward in tonnage and percentages. How many thousand tons of pig iron this month? What share of the monthly plan fulfilled? Because profit is irrelevant and the plan is sovereign. The local economy is a company town on a state scale. The Magnitogorsk Iron and Steel Works is the hub. Auxiliary shops and state-run services orbit it. Money circulates inside a loop where wages are paid. State stores collect rubles, and the rubles don't represent consumer abundance so much as permission to participate. Value is officially measured in steel output, and unofficially measured in access to boots, access to soap, access to a heated corner, access to a doctor who can see you before the line ends. When coal deliveries are late because another commissariat misses its own target, the failure ripples through Magnitogorsk as idle time and lost output reads, in the moral accounting system, like a sin with someone's name attached. Rationing makes the city's hierarchy legible without calling it hierarchy, which is a useful trick in a society that claims to be abolishing class. In 1932-33, during famine conditions across much of the USSR, Magnitogorsk's food distribution runs through categories that translate a person's importance into grams. Skilled workers, shock workers, engineers, party carders, and specialists receive better allocations. Unskilled laborious and coerced populations at the margins receive less. Illustrative figures: 500 grams of bread for a priority category, 200 for a lower one, capture the logic even when local specifics vary by supply crisis and decree. Work output becomes survival probability. A canteen line is a census of value as the plan defines it. A ration card is a small document with the power to decide whether a family is hungry, and the document's authority is backed by the city's shortage. In that environment, rubles are less persuasive than a stamp. The moral claim says labor is dignity. The ration system turns labor into calories. Incentives operate on the same principle: convert compliance into output, output into reward, reward into more compliance. Socialist competition boards and public praise in Magnitogorsky Rabachi become an internal currency because recognition can be exchanged for better assignments and better protection from suspicion. Udarniki status can mean preferential rations. Later, after 1935, Stakhanovism formalizes the logic at a national scale, turning hyperproductive workers into celebrities who receive bonuses and perks, and making the wage structure explicitly unequal as a motivational tool. Egalitarian rhetoric stays on posters while differential access appears in store queues. Foreign specialists, numbering in the hundreds at the project's height, about 380 Americans at one point according to accounts, live in a segregated enclave with better food and the American Club, because the plan has exceptions for people who keep furnaces from exploding. Local elites occupy better conditions in places like Berezka. The city teaches the lesson unintentionally: socialism can abolish bourgeois privilege as long as it also invents a new kind of privilege, one justified as technical necessity and political reliability. Scarcity produces its own economy even when the official economy insists it has abolished the market. Money exists, goods vanish. In memoir accounts, a pair of boots can matter more than a handful of rubles because winter converts footwear into life expectancy. Soap, mittens, nails, flour, basic items become commodities in an informal trade that operates alongside official distribution. Theft rises not because morality disappears but because survival is being priced in unavailable goods. Shanghai's crowded shelters and mud lanes create spaces where roving gangs can steal food, where black market exchange becomes a parallel supply chain, and where the state responds with policing because policing is faster to deploy than a water system. NKVD raids on black marketeers and deserters in 1932-33 are enforcement actions that also function as economic interventions, suppress the unofficial market so the official rationing system remains the only lawful path to calories. The paperwork calls it order. The effect is that people learn to trade quietly and to treat visibility as risk. The city's internal supply chains try to patch the gaps in a way that reveals the plan's priorities. Collective farms outside Magnitogorsk are organized to provide vegetables. Yields stay low because the soil is poor and the project was sited for ore, not agriculture. A brick factory and sawmill exist to feed construction, because capital goods are the plan's favored child. Consumer needs remain secondary and therefore chronic. The result is a place where the official metric of success, steel output, can rise while the lived metric, whether a clinic has bandages, whether a bathhouse has heat, stays volatile. In this setting, myth becomes a material force. Producing a propaganda victory has economic weight because careers depend on what can be reported upward, and what can be reported upward tends to be what can be expressed numerically. Pushing a month of record tonnage can be valued even if it damages equipment and creates future downtime, because the record can be printed today and the repair can be explained later as sabotage by someone conveniently arrestable. The furnace itself is where the plan's metaphysics gets audited by Firebrick. Blast Furnace No. 1's first iron in February 1932 is celebrated as proof that the impossible timetable can be met, and then the furnace has to be shut down and rebuilt in 1933 because rushed construction damages refractory lining. The claim treats time as a resource you can command, the furnace treats time as something you either give it or you pay later. When production is framed as morality, technical failure becomes a moral problem in search of a moral culprit, and the city's paperwork expands to keep pace: more reports, more investigations, more reasons why output did not match the promise. The plan does not accept, "we needed longer," as an explanation, it accepts, "we will rebuild faster," as a solution, and rebuilding becomes another proof opportunity. In a system like this, even a breakdown is recruited back into the story as evidence of heroic persistence, and the day continues because the whistle continues. The first time the plan's tyranny becomes physical is when it starts counting people as if they were ore. Magnitogorsk goes from a few hundred on the steppe in 1929 to a number that's already spilling past the drawings by the early 1930s, and the arithmetic never pauses to ask where the extra bodies will sleep, wash, or be treated when they collapse. Planners had mapped something like a city for 50,000. By 1932 the place is already being described in six figures, a rush so fast that even the word population feels like paperwork pretending to be weather. After the first winter drives workers to flee cold, hunger, typhus, the kind of conditions that make a rail line look like a rope out of a pit, the response is not a wage bump or a housing miracle. In early 1931, the state turns travel into a privilege that has to be granted, not taken. Internal passports restricting movement, paper turned into a gate. In May 1931, under OGPU escort, trainloads of special settlers arrive. Dispossessed peasant families dumped into guarded barrack camps ringed with barbed wire on the outskirts of the same project that calls itself a new civilization. Through 1931, roughly 40,000 peasant families are relocated into the Magnitogorsk orbit, and alongside them come Gulag prisoners shipped in for the hardest work, a count reaching more than 26,000 convicts by the end of 1933 in internal tallies. In John Scott's later memoir, a Tatar worker named Shaimat Kybulin is simply there, reading Pravda in a barrack. The detail is small, almost domestic, until you notice what it means to be learning letters inside a city whose main tool for solving shortages is a train manifest. When bodies arrive faster than walls, the city invents living space the way a man invents warmth, by burning whatever's at hand and calling it temporary. Shanghai becomes the name for the mud hut sprawl thrown up by workers who can't get room in dormitories. A word from another continent repurposed as local geography. American town becomes the name for the enclave where foreigners and valued specialists have electricity and better food, a separate noun for a separate standard of life. Between those two names sits the Ural River, and between the river and the plant sits the daily proof that a modernist blueprint does not lay pipe by itself. By 1933 there is still only one small hospital serving a city already well beyond what the planners claimed they were building. Typhus and other outbreaks appear in memoirs and diaries as seasonal facts, as predictable as the first thaw turning streets into slurry. Sanitation in Shanghai is not a policy debate but an absence, scarce water, open sores, disease moving through a settlement that grew because the workforce did. The built environment is full of promises that behave like verbs, dining halls, schools, parks, socialist way of life, while the lived environment is full of objects that behave like constraints, ration lines, barrack bunks, clinic queues, the posted rules about what you can carry, where you can sleep, when you have to report for a shift. For Scheimat, the paper in his hands is not just newsprint, it is one of the few surfaces in the city that arrives finished, a clean rectangle of text in a place where the walls are still wet. Inside the plant, scaling doesn't feel like a crowd, it feels like too many hands on too few tools and not enough time to teach anyone how not to die. Magnitogorsk and the Kombinat are asked to supervise a workforce swollen by Komsomol recruits, raw villagers, skilled blast furnace men transferred from the Don base, special settlers under guard, convicts with no exit, and foreign specialists whose passports make them both useful and suspect. Foremen end up responsible for far more workers than any safe industrial logic recommends, and the city's early ideal of mentorship collapses into an improvisational training regime where a 90-day technical course is expected to substitute for years of craft. In the production record, the most famous milestone arrives as a date stamped into the plant's mythology and its maintenance log at the same time. Blast Furnace No. 1, Komsomolka, is fired up on the 31st of January, 1932 in roughly -30°C weather, and by the 1st of February it produces its first pig iron, a triumph announced in Pravda as if a headline could insulate bricks. The furnace's glory is brief in the way rushed construction often is. It has to be shut down and fully rebuilt in 1933 because the refractory lining is wrecked by the speed of the build. Even without a narrator, that sequence tells you what the system is doing: convert time pressure into damaged infrastructure, then demand that the damaged infrastructure prove the plan was realistic. If Scheimat is learning to read while the blast furnaces are learning to break, the curriculum is consistent. Letters, like steel, are supposed to be produced on schedule. Scale also makes the city's coordination problems feel less like mistakes and more like a permanent condition of being alive inside an overclocked machine. Coal deliveries have to hit furnace schedules, rail spurs have to keep up with ore extraction, housing construction has to keep pace with recruiting and deportation, clinics have to keep pace with disease. Everything is interlocked and the communications technology is basic: telephones, messengers, meetings, so every delay is a ripple that becomes a stoppage. Downtime is not only lost production, it's risk, because quotas are political and lagging has turned into an accusation category waiting for a name to attach to it. A broken conveyor belt can trigger a cascade, longer shifts to make up losses, machinery run beyond safe tolerances, corners cut on maintenance, accidents that look like misfortune and then get described as intent. The narrative the city tells itself has to keep the plan sacred, so the system develops a habit of treating reality as if it were a hostile witness to be managed. The scale lesson isn't abstract. It's in the way a repair note can become a liability, in the way a foreman learns that reporting truthfully can be more dangerous than improvising a lie that keeps the numbers moving. The environment doesn't scale politely either, it scales as consequence. More furnaces lit means more smoke and dust, and by the late 1930s descriptions of Magnitogorsk are read like a technical specification for endurance: thick, heavy, a pall hanging over streets and blocks, soot behaving like an extra season. Industrial disease becomes part of the city's medical ledger: silicosis, respiratory damage, bodies paying for speed in the currency of lungs. The Ural River, which the city relies on for water, takes industrial runoff back as a return gift. Contamination is not a metaphor but a practical fact that shapes what people drink and wash in. Improvised infrastructure magnifies risk, makeshift dams and rushed waterworks can flood what they're supposed to protect. And the history of the city includes failures that submerge areas precisely because the impulse to build fast outruns the ability to build reliably. Somewhere in this collision of modernist intention and step reality sits a cruelly neat irony. The project imports architects and planners to produce order, and then the simplest forces, wind direction, ice, soot, water, continue to behave as if they never got the memo. A city meant to demonstrate mastery over nature ends up recording its dependence on nature in the form of smoke patterns and contaminated banks. As the city expands into anonymity, social trust becomes another resource that gets depleted. Small brigades where people know each other's habits give way to crowded streets full of strangers whose backgrounds are unknown and often dangerous to ask about, ex-prisoners, desperate newcomers, men transferred under orders, families dumped under guard. Scarcity turns that anonymity into friction, and by the late 1930s contemporary reports cite robberies as common, theft and interpersonal violence rising in the same years the propaganda insists camaraderie is deepening. By the mid-1930s the place even acquires a nickname that says more than its boosters ever meant to: Red Chicago, a comparison that suggests nighttime lawlessness, gangs, and a boomtown energy that sits badly inside a planned socialist showpiece. When special militia units are reportedly needed to restore order, the implication is not that socialism is failing as an idea, it's that the city is running like a frontier town and the state knows it. Local print culture mirrors the contradiction with a straight face. Magnitogorsk Rabachi celebrates socialist competition and model workers, then scolds absenteeism and theft in the language of moral hygiene because structural failure is not an acceptable diagnosis. In Scott's account, Scheimat reads Pravda, in the life of the city, a paper like that is also a behavior manual, delivering the approved vocabulary that lets you say discipline instead of fear, and hooliganism instead of hunger. Once the community is too large to be governed by familiarity, it starts getting governed by something else, the ability to define what a fact means. Meetings and self-criticism sessions become procedural tools, formal rooms where confession and denunciation are staged as civic education. The unwritten rule running beneath them is narrow enough to fit on a banner: you can admit errors, but you must not imply the system produced them. A broken machine can be described as technical trouble or as sabotage depending on what kind of explanation will protect the people in charge, and protection is a scarce commodity in a hierarchy where accountability flows downward. In practice, party cadres and NKVD personnel are difficult to accuse, while ordinary workers and engineers are easy to blame. Even when accusation flows laterally among equals, it rarely moves upward unless Moscow signals that it's safe. Informers gain power not through charisma but through proximity to enforcement, because a whispered report can become an arrest. A civilization built on the promise of turning peasants into modern citizens ends up teaching another kind of literacy alongside reading and welding: which sentences are safe, which words are fatal, which truths must be rerouted into coded phrases like temporary difficulties. In a barrack where Scheimat is learning letters, the social grammar is also being learned: enthusiasm in public, caution in private, and a constant awareness that the audience might include someone who is paid, or coerced, to listen. The city's egalitarian story collapses most visibly where it can't hide, in who gets access to comfort. Privilege leaves architecture behind, and Magnitogorsk grows a geography that doubles as a hierarchy. American town has electricity and better provisions, its existence justified by contracts, training needs, and the logic of keeping foreign specialists functional. Shanghai is mud huts and improvised stoves, its existence justified by nothing except the fact that bodies arrived and had to sleep somewhere. Between them, an elite enclave described as Berezka contrasts explicitly with the slums, and the contrast is not subtle enough to be propaganda's secret. Special distribution channels supply party officials and managers first, closed stores and restricted allotments mean that equality is practiced as an aspiration while hierarchy is practiced as a logistics solution. The unwritten rule is enforced not with a posted law reading, do not question your supervisor's apartment, but with consequences when someone does. Access to scarce goods becomes a form of patronage, and patronage becomes a governance mechanism. Foremen and section chiefs protect loyal subordinates with slightly better supplies, scapegoat someone outside their circle when quotas are missed, and quietly teach everyone that blat, networks, favors, connections, is part of the real constitution. In Scott's memoir, Scheimat reads a state newspaper in a crowded barrack. Around him the city runs on a quieter print culture too: permits, ration lists, distribution notes, and the knowledge that the wrong complaint can turn your hunger into evidence. Stalin's shadow doesn't have to appear in person to narrow life. It arrives as targets, speeches, and the moral language attached to production, a demand that still be treated as national survival and therefore as virtue. The 5-year plan is not an abstract document to a blast furnace crew, it's a calendar that can punish you. Quotas come down from Moscow like natural laws, and local officials learn that the safest way to survive is to behave as though Stalin is watching, which means preemptive obedience and preemptive scapegoating. Shortfalls are not framed as misfortune, they are framed as failure of rule or proof of enemies, because a system that claims history is being forged cannot admit its inputs were insufficient. A missed coal shipment cannot be permitted to remain a missed coal shipment, it must become someone's fault in a moral register. This is how an industrial project develops political reflexes: hide bad news, inflate good news, feed the center an explanation that preserves the myth of control. In a city built to prove socialism's supremacy, the worst sin is not incompetence but honesty that makes the plan look fallible. The founder's influence becomes less about inspiration and more about constriction. It shrinks the list of permissible reasons why reality looks the way it looks. In 1933, a minister arrives and says out loud what the city's mud has been saying all along. Sergei Ordzhonikidze, People's Commissar for Heavy Industry from 1932 to 1937, visits Magnitogorsk and reacts with disgust at the housing standards. He reportedly scoffs that what's being called a socialist city is manure, a line that survives precisely because it matches what everyone can see and what few can safely speak. His interventions matter because they aren't poetic, they are operational. He can push for speed when speed is worship, then criticize flaws when flaws threaten legitimacy, and both gestures function as governance in a system where a phone call from Moscow can reorder a city. Orders associated with his visit include shifting new housing across the Ural River to the West Bank, away from smoke and the industrial sprawl, a geographic lever that changes who sleeps where and how long it takes to walk to a shift whistle. The same year, Magnitogorsk can point to a palace of culture and a stadium, visible proof that the Steel City is also becoming a new way of life, because patronage demands artifacts you can photograph. The status puncture here is built into the choreography. Modernist plans drafted by Ernst May and his brigade promise standardized blocks and green belts, and then a Soviet minister has to stand in the mud and rename the result in the vocabulary of barnyards. The rules that actually govern behavior in this environment aren't printed in a constitution. They're enforced through what gets you punished and what gets you protected. Certain truths become unspeakable. Open sympathy for special settlers and gulag prisoners is taboo because official categories require those populations to be criminals or enemies, deserving their fate, and sympathy itself can be recoded as disloyalty. Criticizing the plan is unsafe because saying the plan is unrealistic implies someone above you is wrong, and in Stalinism wrongness is contagious. People learn to tuck complaints into acceptable language, temporary difficulties, isolated shortcomings, individual deviations, because structural explanations are treated as ideological attacks. Some write letters up the hierarchy, even to Stalin, gambling that the leader's attention can override local abuse. The gamble includes the possibility that the letter gets intercepted by the very people it complains about. Displays of enthusiasm become protective coloration, extravagant praise can function like a shield. In the city's informal economy of survival, the ability to invoke authority becomes another resource. A party connection can spare you a charge, an NKVD acquaintance can redirect blame, a patron can arrange a better assignment. The moral universe is now governed by an unwritten logic that every worker learns without a textbook. Keep your head down, choose your allies carefully, and remember that the state is capable of changing what words mean overnight. In February 1937, the protective layer around Magnitogorsk thins. Ordzhonikidze dies, widely suspected suicide under Stalin's pressure, and the loss matters in the city not as personal tragedy but as institutional exposure. The Great Purge is intensifying across the Soviet Union, and a place like Magnitogorsk, with accidents, shortfalls, and strategic importance, is perfectly designed for industrial problems to be retranslated as political crimes. Patronage had offered a kind of cover. A minister invested in your project could sometimes frame failures as technical difficulties. Once that cover is gone, breakdowns become raw material for denunciation. The founder's shadow turns practical, fear becomes administrative. A missed target, a cracked furnace lining, a collapsed scaffold, events produced by rushed construction and undertrained labor, can be reclassified as intention because the political system cannot accept that its own pressure produces predictable failure. The city's managers now operate under a specific constraint. It is safer to overpromise and conceal than to report and request, because requests imply need, and need implies the plan was miscalculated. The purge enters the record as a chain of documents that feel like the state practicing handwriting on human lives. In 1936, after an accident involving an open hearth furnace, plant director G. Korolkov and several engineers are arrested and accused of wrecking. An industrial accident, the kind you would expect in a complex plant being run with overstressed maintenance and constant pressure, becomes evidence of counter-evolution because the system requires a villain when it cannot accept physics. In NKVD language, intent can be inferred from outcome. If production drops, someone wanted it to drop. That logic turns signatures into traps. People who have their names on plans, safety reports, repair notes, and work orders become targets precisely because paperwork is how work is authorized. A furnace failure can be translated into an arrest warrant, and the machinery of enforcement, interrogation, prosecution, imprisonment, execution, gives that translation teeth. The lesson isn't delivered as philosophy, it's delivered as disappearance, as empty desks, as a sudden vacancy in the chain of command followed by a meeting where the absence is explained in the approved vocabulary. In a city where keeping the furnaces running is already emergency labor, political terror adds another input, speech discipline, a requirement that everyone treat the state's explanation as the only safe reality. By 1937, the net widens into the city's political leadership, making the unwritten rules impossible to misunderstand. The party secretary, S.P. Bishayev, is arrested for an alleged Trotskyite conspiracy. The charge tells you less about the details than about the purpose, which is to demonstrate vigilance by producing enemies. The chief of construction, B. Kazakov, is executed in 1937, a fate that lands like an indictment of the idea that expertise is stable protection. Chief engineer Ivan Pavlovich Bardin, tasked with making imported and improvised technology behave, operates with the knowledge that competence can increase danger because competence brings you closer to responsibility, and responsibility brings your name closer to the file. Foreign specialists, present through contracts with firms like Arthemke and others, can sometimes leave. Their departure reduces the city's skill pool even as output demands rise. The purge doesn't fix technical problems, it removes the people most able to describe them honestly. The city's real constitution now includes a rhythm of promotions, decorations, arrests, and denunciations that can all be processed through the same state with the same straight-faced claim of necessity. In Scott's pages, Scheimat is still a worker learning to read. In the purge's paperwork, literacy also means knowing how quickly a person can be turned into an example. The moral reframing that makes this system livable is crafted with care and delivered everywhere, in newspapers, in meetings, in banners hung over shop floors, in the honor boards that post names as if they were production tools. The Stakhanovite movement arrives in the mid-1930s as a hyperproductivity religion, and Magnitogorsk is built to stage it. Steel pourers and furnace crews claim record outputs, and the local Stakhanovite like Mikhail Kopylov becomes famous for doubling shift output, a feat that may be embellished by the press but is useful either way because it supplies a hero. This is where the egalitarian story learns to coexist openly with incentive structures. Differential wages and privileges appear as policy tools, better housing, better rations, and access to goods move toward those labeled exemplary, not because class has vanished but because the state needs performance and has to buy it somehow. In a city with closed distribution channels, being named a hero of labor is not only symbolic, it can be a material survival strategy. Scheimat's reading habit now sits in a new light. The newspaper in a barrack doesn't merely report the world, it tells you who is safe to admire, which output counts as virtue, which like counts as betrayal, and how to speak about suffering without making it sound like criticism. Once labor is treated as virtue, exhaustion can be treated as sin. The system develops a ready translation for ordinary human responses. Complaint becomes lack of consciousness, doubt becomes sabotage, fatigue becomes moral weakness, and leaving becomes treason. Those who try to quit are labeled labor deserters, a term that makes a personal decision sound like military betrayal. In 1932, quitting is codified as a punishable offense, turning labor discipline into something that behaves like criminal law. Housing grievances become whining of kulak elements, safety concerns become obstruction, insistence on time becomes resistance to history. The phrase, temporary difficulties, is deployed like a solvent that dissolves present suffering into future promise, a rhetorical tool that can be printed in Pravda and repeated by a foreman without either of them having to stand in the mud. Coercion is reframed as care. The NKVD's arrests are described as purification, forced labor is described as discipline, surveillance becomes vigilance, denunciation becomes civic duty. In some formulations, dissent is even medicalized. Disease of doubt, requiring cure, so that disagreement can be treated as pathology rather than argument. It's a closed moral loop. The system is always right, and any feeling that it isn't can be recoded as proof you are wrong in a way that is dangerous. The same reframing reaches into families, turning loyalty into a hierarchy where the state sits above kin. Children are taught to value vigilance, and in the broader Stalinist culture there are cases where reporting anti-Soviet talk by parents is described as duty. Whether a particular lesson is taught in a particular classroom in Magnitogorsk is less important than the system's direction of travel, which is to reassign moral authority upward. The counterproductive effect is immediate and intimate. Colleagues become wary of each other, private speech narrows, humor becomes a risk, and public meetings become performances of loyalty. The moral collapse is not a sudden change in personality, it's a change in what language is safe. People learn to speak as if the state is always present, because it can become present at any time. The city's promise was transformation, peasants into workers, villages into modernity, and the method includes a transformation of ethics. Suffering is framed as proof of virtue, and the institutions that cause suffering are framed as guardians. In Scott's ecosystem of names, Scheimat, Ivan, Shapkov, individuals stay stubbornly human. In the state's ecosystem of categories, individuals become inputs and risks. Spectacle is what makes this machine exportable. Magnitogorsk is packaged for audiences who will never stand in Shanghai or see barbed wire on the outskirts, and the packaging comes as objects you can hold. USSR in Construction dedicates an issue in January 1932 to Magnitostroy, the giant and the builder, using photomontage and heroic imagery to turn scaffolds and cranes into an epic. It supplies a shop brigade worker named Victor as a face, because a project needs human figures the way it needs furnaces. In tourist prints glossy posters around 1930 to 31 inviting outsiders to see USSR, framing the Magnitogorsk steel mills as sightseeing the way older countries frame cathedrals. Tourism and industrial policy share a brochure. Newsreels with titles like, "Steel is our strength," turn production into a festival, an aesthetic of speed designed to be consumed at a safe distance. Boris Ivans's 1933 film Song of Heroes stages mass songs and furnaces as socialist epic, supervised, edited, valuable as a record of what the state wants to show and unreliable as a record of what the city is. Valentin Kativ's 1932 novel Time, Forward, turns the construction frenzy into narrative virtue, characters racing to beat records and shouting, "Time, forward," while the refrain, "Never again shall we be Asia," echoes Stalin's 1931 anxiety about catching up with the West. These artifacts don't need to persuade the people coughing in smoke, they need to persuade the people far enough away that paper can substitute for sanitation. Official narration also comes as books that function less like history and more like selective memory manufactured in advance. A planning pamphlet like Magnitogorsk in Plan and Reality, published in 1932, can call the place a laboratory of the new socialist way of life, describing communal dining halls and parks as if the built environment has already caught up with the intention. A 1939 commemorative volume, Magnitogorsk, Epic of the First Five-Year Plan, compiled under Soviet authority by A. Bykov, packs statistics and smiling photographs into an object whose main function is omission. No gulag labor, no barbed wire, no purge wave that removed managers and engineers from the very institutions being praised. The silence is not a flaw, it's the method. If you can make certain bodies disappear on paper, you can ask the audience to behave as if those bodies were never part of the bill of materials. Even the city's cultural infrastructure, the Palace of Culture, stadium, parades, becomes part of the evidence kit. Things a guided visitor can be shown to demonstrate that steel has produced not only output but civilization. The state learns to do what modern corporations will later do with branding, turn a complex, contested reality into a coherent, portable story that can survive contact with distant eyes. Outside the USSR, the reception splits because the same facts are readable as marvel or menace. During the Great Depression, Western factories sit idle while Soviet propaganda shows cranes moving. For many foreign leftists and fellow travelers, projects like Magnitogorsk feel like proof that an alternative system can mobilize resources when capitalism is stalling. The British Fabians Sidney and Beatrice Webb, in Soviet Communism, A New Civilization. 1935, cite Soviet industrial achievements as evidence of economic miracle, and the miracle is easier to believe when the information arrives through guided channels. In tourist tours are designed to deliver proof. A route through West Bank apartments, a Palace of Culture performance, a staged enthusiastic brigade, the clean lines of planned blocks, then a quick exit before anyone wanders into Shanghai or starts unmonitored conversations. This choreography is not incidental, it is the governance of reputation. At the same time, skeptics look at the timeline and see violation of normal construction physics. The March 1930 contract with Arthur Key, the January-February 1932 furnace milestone, the 3-year schedule that even American engineers considered fantasy. Admiration and alarm mingle in professional circles because speed can be read as competence or as evidence of coercion strong enough to break ordinary limits. Critique travels differently, through whispers, intelligence reports, defectors, and the occasional document that leaks out. Polish and Japanese intelligence circulate rumors about mass deaths at Soviet industrial sites, including Magnitogorsk, some exaggerated and some grounded in the real toll of cold, hunger, disease, and forced labor. Western press coverage ranges from uncritical repetition to suspicious distance. Walter Durante of the New York Times, Pulitzer-winning and famously accommodating to Soviet narratives, writes romantic lines about Russians turning an entire mountain into steel, turning coercion into engineering in the reader's mind. Other Western writers and journalists, Eugene Lyons, Gareth Jones, help cultivate skepticism about Soviet triumph stories by reporting on concealed human costs and state secrecy, even when precise details are hard to verify from outside a tightly controlled system. Nazi propaganda by the late 1930s weaponizes Magnitogorsk too, portraying Soviet industry as grotesque warning, often with anti-Semitic overlays and cartoonish exaggerations. The propaganda is vile, but it also depends on a real substrate: forced labor, guarded populations, a police state, because fear campaigns need something to distort. Magnitogorsk becomes a contested symbol before history hardens judgment, a mirror held up to whatever the viewer already believes about modernity, power, and sacrifice. The most durable foreign reaction comes from someone who can cross the border twice. John Scott arrives in 1932 as an American idealist, works as a welder and foreman inside the city's industrial machine, marries a Russian doctor, leaves in 1937, and publishes Behind the Urals in 1942 with the awkward authority of a witness who was both participant and outsider. He writes about frozen machinery, typhus outbreaks, informers, and the cart that can roll through barracks in winter, asking, with bureaucratic directness stripped down to plain speech, any dead today? He names people: Shaimat Kybulin, a Tatar ex-header learning to read while building a blast furnace; Shabkov, an ex-kulak cracking jokes despite missing fingers from frostbite, details that refuse to behave like slogans. Other evidence accumulates on different timelines: a diary like Simonova's from 1931, published later, oral histories collected after 1991 when people can speak more freely, grassroots, books of memory, in the 2000s listing repressed or deceased residents, Stephen Kotkin's Magnetic Mountain, 1995, using archival material to reconstruct not only policy but the unwritten rules. The ecosystem of evidence is itself part of the story: propaganda, local papers, NKVD files, memoirs, later reconstructions, each with its own incentives and silences, each an artifact of how the system wanted to be seen or how it could finally be described. For Soviet citizens inside Magnitogorsk, exit is not an option the way it is in smaller utopian communities where disillusioned members can leave and take their labor with them. Internal passports restrict movement, labor discipline is enforced as law, borders are not metaphors. Scott can leave because a US passport can sometimes do what Soviet internal documentation is designed to prevent: it can open gates. For Shaimat, paper is a different kind of object. It is the newspaper he reads in a barrack, the permit system that limits travel, the work record that ties him to a brigade, the meeting notes that decide what words are safe. The system's viability is tested less by whether people can vote with their feet than by whether the state can hold together under external pressure, whether the furnaces keep running when the stakes are national survival, whether the coercive machinery can keep feeding itself without collapsing. By 1940-41, Magnitogorsk is producing around 10 to 11% of Soviet steel, which turns it from utopian showroom into strategic asset. Other states have to factor its output into their calculations, and Magnitogorsk envy or anxiety becomes not only ideological but actuarial. When Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union in June 1941, the plant's deep Ural location makes it a refuge for production, and post-war accounts will sometimes boast, with the same bluntness propaganda favors, about how directly Magnitogorsk's steel fed the Soviet war machine. The mountain does become steel, and the steel becomes power, and the cost remains legible in the trail of documents that survive the smoke: celebratory books that omit names, secret files that invent intent, censuses that correct myth with numbers, memoirs that break scripts, and the long, patient work of putting erased people back into print.